most important person during a crime scene investigation is the first officer to arrive on scene. The first responding officer can make or break an investigation, therefore understanding protocol is crucial to any case. The journey from crime to conviction begins with the first responding officer. Let's take a look at some of the issues an officer can face if they arrive first at the scene. When arriving at a crime scene, the first responding officer needs to quickly address several things. Your first priority is to do what needs to be done in order to obtain control of the situation and to render it as safe as possible. The safety and well-being of individuals present must take priority. The removal of any potential threats to themselves and others must be taken care of before first aid is administered to those already on the crime scene. This encompasses self-protection for the officer while ensuring that the threat of additional victims is minimized. Next, the officer needs to care for the injured. If the victim or victims are still alive, an attempt could be made to take a dying declaration. Once people at the crime scene have been attended to, the important work of crime scene investigation begins. Step 1 involves dealing with the evidence. First, make sure that all potential evidence is preserved. The first responding officer should try to find the entry and exit points of the suspects and victims in order to direct emergency personnel to enter the crime scene through another point or pathway. This is how the least amount of evidence is disturbed. At this point, anything may be considered evidence and could potentially be utilized for a conviction in a court of law. Before the crime scene is secure, it is easy to destroy evidence. The presence of relatives of victims, the media, or even the officer themselves can easily affect the state of evidence. Crime scenes can be chaotic with injuries, loss of life, traumatized witnesses, and media arriving on scene. It is important that the first responding officer records as much information as possible. It may be too difficult to write everything down verbatim, but a record of just jot notes in their police notebook will help to serve as a chronological record of what took place. Notes may be used by investigators to decide how to proceed, by prosecutors to decide how to try the case, and by defense attorneys to question the police action taken. Everything from treatment of the injured to the apparent nature of the crime should be noted. Document what was seen, what was done, and who was there. In addition to written notes, the officer should also make mental notes as he conducts a visual inspection of the scene. If possible, the first officer should use their phones to take pictures of the crime scene. The first officer to respond to a crime scene dictates the overall direction of the investigation. If the actions of the first responding officer are undocumented or poorly organized, the crime scene investigation may lack direction. The first responding officer should secure and protect the crime scene, focusing on the immediate area. The officer should do whatever he can to gain control of the scene. As more officers arrive at the scene, it can be expanded and duties can be parceled out. Preserving the crime scene is one of the most important responsibilities of the first arriving officer. This revolves around 3 basic duties: establishing a perimeter, determining the suspect's movements, and keeping unauthorized people out of the crime scene. The nature of your call will determine how large your perimeter needs to be. Usually, crime scene tape will be utilized to identify the perimeter. It's always better to go big at first because you can always shrink it down later. Keep in mind that for more serious calls or for scenes that cover a wider area, you might have to use roadblocks, post officers at key points, or even use other government agency assets to help block off major roads. It's hard to get a conviction without evidence, so you need to preserve as much of the crime scene as possible. First responding officers must try and establish the nature of the suspect's movements within the crime scene. They need to establish where the suspect's point of entry was, how they moved around inside the crime scene, and where they exited if they're not found at the scene. The exit point is especially critical because it helps you find their direction of travel. If you can't secure anything else, secure the exit point because it is where your K9 unit will begin tracking. Keep everyone away from this area until the tracking is finished. This also involves establishing a safe pathway for emergency personnel to utilize when they arrive on scene. As the first responding officer, dealing with victims is considered a priority, but dealing with witnesses is also very important. As quickly as possible, you must identify all witnesses and keep them at the scene. Witnesses often have second thoughts, so conduct thorough questioning at the scene. Keep witnesses separated to avoid collaboration of their testimony. And remember that people's memories always fade, and outside influences may impact a witness's decision to cooperate later. Once the responding officer has the crime scene locked down, they must control and record who comes in and out. They must treat the crime scene like classified information on a need-to-know basis only. They must create a single guarded entrance, therefore everyone wanting to go in or out must pass through that point. The first responding officer should create a crime scene log documenting anyone going in or out by the date, time, and reason that they entered the crime scene. It is considered good practice to advise officers that if they enter the crime scene, that they may be subject to writing a supplemental report and that they may have to appear in court. Under the Police Service Act of Ontario, police officers have a common law authority to investigate crime and enforce the law. Common law authorizes first responding officers to enter without warrant a crime scene, to perform a search for victims, offenders, and weapons to ensure their own personal safety. Officers' safety considerations at a crime scene are imperative. Security of the officer searching a crime scene needs to be enforced in order to prevent the suspect from returning to the scene and from potentially creating a hostile situation for other investigators. Always remember to protect your crime scene technicians and other investigators. Do not be quick to clear the area and leave them alone if your suspect is still at large. It is also of the utmost importance that any actions taken by the first responding officer in regards to weapons is documented. A weapon may be required to be moved in order to secure the scene or to enable EMS to perform care for victims. The officer needs to document what he moved and where he moved it. There is also no eating, drinking, or smoking at a crime scene, so if you are going to be there for a while, please make sure you have a designated area for these things. As you can see, the first responding officer holds a tremendous amount of responsibility, not only for the crime scene, but also for the overall investigation. It is easy to tell a first responding officer what to do if he's part of a large department which has dedicated crime scene officers and detectives to turn the case over to. However, in smaller agencies, the first officer at the scene may end up taking on the roles themselves. As a first responding officer, you must be aware of your limits and capabilities and when to call other agencies with the right expertise.